So, a topic that I see coming up again and again, particularly on flight sim groups on Facebook, is what PC should I build for Microsoft Flight Sim 2024? So let's run through some things I think you should know before you part with your hard-earned cash. So before you do anything, there are some key things we need to talk about and understand. First up, you should be asking yourself, what FPS target are you going after? Because unlike a lot of other games where hundreds of FPS is often a totally justifiable goal, Flight Sim is a little bit different. You can have a really great experience with as little as 30 FPS. Keep in mind that Flight Sim is not a twitchy first-person shooter like Call of Duty, for example, where millisecond level reaction times are the difference between a win or a loss. The truth is that with Flight Sim, even during critical phases of flight, such as being on short final approach, the level of movement you're going to see on screen is very mild. Looking out of your plane window, the scenery will be moving by relatively slowly, and a solid, stable 30 FPS can absolutely give you a really nice experience. While 60 FPS is fantastic, I definitely consider that to be more of a luxury rather than a necessity. The second thing you need to ask yourself is, what resolution are you going to be playing at? 1080p, 1440p, 4K, something else? I don't know, maybe an ultra-wide? If you're targeting 1080p 30 FPS, your build will be vastly different to if you're targeting 60 FPS at 4K. Once you've got some answers to these questions, you could start by looking at the recommended system requirements for Microsoft Flight Sim 2024, which are published online, though we'll talk more about these later, as honestly they do seem a little bit weird to me. Now, as I sit here today making this video, Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 isn't out yet, therefore you've got two options. You can go with what they say in the system requirements chart, or you can wait. You can wait for people like me and others to test Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 with their hardware, to give you a better idea of how it really works in the real world. I cannot in good conscience recommend you build or buy anything right now, not until the sim has been in the hands of the public and we've got lots of real world usage data to look at. So we need to talk about CPUs and how Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 was and remains massively CPU limited. What does this mean? Well, let's say you've got an 8-core processor. Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 is really bad at spreading out its workload across all 8 of your processor cores. It typically does most of its work on one of your CPU's cores, with the others just sat there not doing very much at all. This means you could find yourself in a situation where your graphics card could potentially render, let's say, 120 frames per second in Flight Sim, but your CPU can only process, 35 of those frames. This means your frames per second is limited to 35 frames per second due to your CPU being the bottleneck. I've got a 5800 X3D and a 4080 Super, and almost always my GPU is sat there between 50 to 70% usage at 4K Ultra, due to my CPU being the bottleneck and therefore holding back my GPU. Now, Microsoft Flight Sim 24 claims to be better at using multiple cores, so perhaps my 8-core 5800 X3D processor will get a new lease of life, negating the need for a further upgrade. But again, Flight Sim 24 isn't out yet. We don't have real-world data yet. We don't actually have answers to this stuff. I live in hope though, as in Flight Sim 2020 at a very busy Gatwick Airport on VATSIM using a third-party study-level airplane like the Phoenix A320, it's not uncommon to see my frames per second dip into the mid to low 20s, and that is entirely because my CPU is being the bottleneck. My GPU is just sat there chilling out for the most part. And we should talk about the X3D processors from AMD a little bit more. It's become fairly common knowledge that for Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, an AMD X3D processor is generally your best bet. For those that don't know, the X3D means that on top of the CPU cores, AMD have laid a slab of cache on top of them. And Flight Sim 2020 absolutely adores this cache. Fun fact, the latest 9800 X3D model that's just come out, they've actually flipped it so the cache is underneath the CPU cores now. That means the CPU cores aren't insulated by the cache and can therefore run faster. So I'm on the first generation of this X3D product, that is the 5800 X3D. Since then, we've had the 7800 X3D, which has largely been considered the best CPU for Flight Sim 2020. And only a few days ago, at the time of recording, we've seen the 9800 X3D, which improves upon the 7800 X3D even further. So let's bring it back to the recommended system requirements for Flight Sim 24. Keep in mind how great the X3D chips have been in Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, and you can imagine my surprise when there wasn't a mention of them in the system requirements chart for Microsoft Flight Sim 2024. Instead, for their ideal spec system, which they've clarified in a developer livestream is targeting 4K Ultra at 30 FPS, they are recommending the AMD 7900X, a 12-core processor, which to me is an odd choice. Yes, it's a 12-core processor, which on the face of it sounds quite impressive and perhaps give credence to their claims of Flight Sim 24 making use of more cores. Why else would they be recommending a 12-core part after all? But it's a 12-core part that's made up of two 6-core chiplets that are connected together. If a task has to be passed between one chiplet to another, there's a performance penalty. You see, AMD build their processors using 8-core chiplets. So a 16-core processor from AMD is two 8-core chiplets connected together, and an 8-core is simply one chiplet on its own. However, in manufacturing, not all of these chiplets come out with all 8 cores intact. So the faulty cores are disabled and they become 6-core chiplets, which can then be used to make 6 or 12-core CPUs. My question is, will it be better to have an X3D 8-core processor made with a single, fully functional chiplet with the Vcache, or will it be better to have a 12-core processor like they're recommending without the Vcache? My gut tells me the Vcache will likely win out here, but again, we don't know. Microsoft Flight Sim 24 isn't out yet. For Intel, on the ideal spec, they're recommending a 14th gen i7, which seems reasonable, but honestly, after the whole degradation thing, I think I'd be giving that a miss. They've claimed to have solved it with a BIOS update, but I don't know. I think I would pass. And their new Core Ultra range seems, quite unimpressive, all things considered. If you've already got an Intel build, great, but I'm not sure I would be considering them for a new build right now. If you're wondering what I'm talking about with the whole CPU degradation thing, Google it. It's a whole thing that I don't have time to get into here. This is all to say, keep your eyes peeled for how the X3D processors perform with Microsoft Flight Sim 2024. I'll be testing with my 5800X3D with my 4080 Super once it's out, and I also have an AMD 5600X CPU here and an NVIDIA 3070, so we can also test on more mid-range components too. So get subbed so you don't miss out on that. Looking at the recommended spec, which is targeting 1440p high at 30 FPS, we see more weirdness in the form of the 2700X from AMD being recommended. This is an old CPU at this point, which you'd probably struggle to find new. I think the reason they've recommended it is due to its 8 cores and their claims of Flight Sim 24 working well on multi-core processors. The good news is that owners of newer 8-core parts from AMD should be in a good position. Parts like the 3700X, 3800X, 5800X, 7700X, and so on. From Intel, we're seeing a 10700 be recommended. Again, you'd probably struggle to find that part new these days, but if you're already on anything that's an i7 and newer than this, for example an 11700 or 12700, you should be in a good position. Okay, it's time to talk about GPUs. For their ideal spec targeting 4K Ultra 30 FPS, we see the NVIDIA 4080 and the AMD 7900 XT being recommended. I'm inclined to agree with them here that these are sensible choices. I run at 4K Ultra, albeit with a few small tweaks, and my 4080 Super can easily output 30 FPS at 4K. If I then enable NVIDIA's frame generation, it generally doubles that, turning 30 into 60. As we said earlier, quite often my GPU will be sat there running at between 50 to 70% usage because, as we said, it's being held back by my processor. So yeah, sensible choices here in my opinion. If you want frame generation from NVIDIA, obviously the NVIDIA card's going to make more sense, albeit it will probably cost you more money. They did say though in a recent developer live stream that they'll be integrating the latest version of FSR, which will bring AMD's frame generation technology to Flight Sim 24, but there isn't a timeline on this yet. Looking at the recommended spec GPUs, we're seeing the 2080 from NVIDIA and the 5700 XT from AMD. I'm surprised to see the 5700 XT here. The 7600 or maybe the 6700 XT from AMD would have been a closer match to the 2080 in my opinion. But anyway, this is targeting 1440p high 30 FPS. If you're running a 3070, 4060 Ti, 6700 XT, 2080 Ti/Super, or even the vanilla 2080, maybe even a 3060. I think you're going to be in the ballpark for a decent experience here. I wouldn't recommend these cards for 4K. My 3070 fell to bits when I tried running it in 4K, but for 1440p and down, these cards are likely going to be fine. You can get a rough idea of a GPU's power by checking Tech PowerUp's GPU database. Now, these are only round numbers, so take it all with a pinch of salt, but it gives you a rough idea. Here you can see we've zeroed in on the 2080, and it tells you where other cards sit relative to it. So if you're within 10% or so of what they're recommending, you're probably going to be all right. Just make sure you have at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And finally, let's talk about RAM. There was a bit of a reaction from the community when it was revealed that they're recommending 64 gigabytes of RAM for their ideal spec PC. But again, in a developer live stream, they made the point that no, the sim will not gobble up 64 gigs of RAM. However, they found that if you're running other applications on your PC alongside the sim, 32 might be a bit tight in some situations. As for me, I'll be running 32 gigs for now. Though if I were building or buying new, I'd probably be going with 64. Relative to other components in your system, RAM doesn't cost a fortune. The difference between 32 and 64 gigs of RAM is around £100-ish here in the UK, and that could be £100 very well spent if you kind of put it in context against the cost of a whole new build. Now, if you're not building but you're buying off the shelf, it's typical for brands to be a bit stingy with RAM and storage, and you might get squeezed here on price. So I wouldn't necessarily blame you if you stuck with 32 in this case. So this is all well and good, but what would I actually recommend you buy or build? And that is a really hard question right now because, as we've said again and again in this video, Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 at the time of recording isn't out yet, and we don't actually know how it will perform on our hardware. If Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 wasn't coming out at all and 2020 was sticking around, I can tell you right now I would be upgrading to a 9800 X3D processor, and I would be keeping my 4080 Super as my GPU is more than enough for 4K Ultra. But where I'm being held back is by my processor. That is the 5800 X3D. Whenever I get massive FPS drops, it's due to the CPU. The sim will even tell you this if you enable the FPS counter. See that there? It says limited by main thread. That is the CPU limiting things. So all I can do is wait and see how Flight Sim 24 performs on the 5800 X3D when it's out. Maybe it will give the 5800 X3D a new lease of life, or maybe I'll still need to upgrade to a 9800 X3D, or maybe something different. But to upgrade to a 9800 X3D, I'll need a new motherboard, I'll need new RAM, and to do it all properly, we're going to be looking at round about £800 to £900. And I'm damned if I'm spending that sort of money without some solid independent data first, and neither should you. Hence my recommendation to wait if you're looking at building something new. If you've already got something in line with what they're recommending, great, give it a whirl, see how it goes. But if you're building or buying new, a little patience here could really go a long, long way. I really hope you all enjoy Flight Sim 24. I'll be streaming it on day one, so get subbed so you don't miss out on that and all of our other Flight Sim 24 content, particularly our hardware testing that we'll be doing. And if you found today's video useful, leaving a like really helps the channel and the video a ton. But I'll leave this one here. Thank you very much for watching, folks. Look after yourselves, be good to each other, and as always, happy flying.